Hi, I'm Steve Duke, and welcome to the Two Roads podcast. Today on the show, we had Philip Doran. Philip is the CEO of HelloFresh Ireland, and he's also my best and honestly longest friend. So, for a bit of context about just how well we know each other, I've known Philip literally my entire life. As in, when I came home from the hospital as a child, Philip was there. We lived on the same street for our entire childhood, went to the same schools, played on a lot of the same sports teams, went to the same uni. We even lived together for a while. And out of college, we actually joined the same company for a little bit too. So we know each other super well. And I think that's one of the reasons that it makes this episode a really interesting conversation between the two of us. So some of the things we talk about. So we talk about what Philip thinks the most important thing people should optimize for early in their career. We talk about why he moved to Ethiopia, where he spent a year, and how it changed him. We talk about the number one skill it takes to get promoted quickly and to land a job as a CEO, because he's landed a CEO job like before he's 30, right? So he's clearly very good at something, and he has an interesting perspective on the skills that you can develop to help you land that job. We talk about why he likes it, his typical day as a CEO, what he does. We talk a lot about his thoughts about stress, both how he performs in stressful situations and what he does to make sure that it doesn't impact his life outside of work, which I found particularly helpful. And he has I would say, like a slightly different view on this of what I've heard from most people before. We talk about the questions that he asks himself before every big decision, both career decisions and life decisions, and also how not to be reliant on your job as a source of happiness, even though he loves his job, and what you can do instead. So this is, I had a lot of fun with this chat with Philip, because I know him so well, and it was really interesting to be able to ask him some questions that, even though I've known him for all this time, I'd never actually asked him before. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Let's get into it. Philip, when you were a kid, I was trying to think about this the other day, right? Because I've obviously known you my entire life. But I was trying to think, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? And I actually didn't know. So I was trying to think, was there anything that you wanted to be when you were a kid?
Yeah, someone actually asked me this recently. I don't know that I know beyond like do you know like the stuff you used to pretend you're a kid, like being like Aragorn from like Lord of the Rings. Like I don't think that I ever, when we're growing up, have like a I don't remember having like a profession beyond like some bizarre sort of fantastical idea. Like I wasn't one of those kids who were sitting around going, "Oh, I can't wait to be an accountant," or even like a fireman, or any of these kind of things. It was kind of more like about head in the clouds, or want to be like a sports person, or like all those kind of things. So no, I don't really remember. I mean, I'm curious. Like, did you? I don't know that I could figure it out for you either, other than like a rugby player or something.
Yeah, I was trying to think about this myself the other day, and I don't think I did either. I think there was a period between maybe when I was like 14 or 15, where for some reason I wanted to be an architect.
I remember this as well, actually. Yeah, this is what you did, like technical drawing in school and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And then I was trying to think, like, where did that come from and where did it go? Because I've very little interest in being an architect. But yeah, that was the only thing I can ever really remember being. And then there's about a 6 month period where I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And then I did like my work experience in TY and was like, I don't like hospitals, not really that great with sick people, and probably shouldn't be a doctor.
Yeah, I feel like we all did that. Well, do you remember, like obviously they were talking at the early stage, but when you then get to school and you're talking to like guidance counselors and stuff, the conversation is not structured around what do you want to do, it's what you could do. And it's like, oh, you're doing pretty well, you can get the points to medicine, therefore that's that one ticked. You're going to be a doctor. It was honestly felt like that.
Oh, 100% it was. I'm sure those sessions are helpful for some people, but like they definitely weren't for me. And yeah, but okay, well, so you didn't become Aragorn.
No, no, the job opening was closed, already taken. Tried my best.
So how do you describe what you do now?
What do I do now? So currently CEO of HelloFresh in Ireland. So manage and lead that business in Ireland. That's kind of what I do on paper. What I do in practice changes massively every day. As anyone that's kind of run either a business or a startup or been involved in one knows, every day is extremely different, and even more so in a direct to consumer business like this. So what I do every day changes a lot, but that's kind of what I do on paper.
I do want to go in at some point and kind of pick apart what one of those days might look like. But in terms of like your path from, like, how would you kind of give a quick summary of your path from school to where you are now? I know there's like lots of different things, but if you give kind of the high level timeline, and then we can go different ones.
Yeah, I'll give the quick one, and I'm sure you'll dive into deeper ones. So I studied economics and finance in college, honestly, because I had the vague idea that I wanted to do business, and no greater idea beyond that. Like, honestly, I had this image of like a man in a suit with a briefcase that goes to work and does business things. So I did economics finance in college. Similarly, we might talk about this in a second, but like went to college with absolutely zero perspective on what I wanted to do afterwards, but also just lack of awareness of even what the opportunities were. And was lucky enough to have an amazing group of kind of people that I was in college with who were just really plugged in, right? They came from either family backgrounds or friend backgrounds or older brothers that had done different paths. So they knew about, tech space, they knew about finance jobs, they knew about consulting, they knew about all of these things, right? That honestly, in my head, were just business. So, that was the main thing that I took from college. I went down the similar path of people not knowing exactly what they wanted to do. Went into McKinsey and Company, so I did consulting for a couple of years. Actually, really enjoyed it, and I can talk about like why I decided to do it and why I actually think there's still a lot of merit in those kind of jobs. Really enjoyed just the growth, working with people, working on interesting projects, learning about problem solving. Really enjoyed my 2 years. Came to the end of it and then wanted to do something completely different, right? And I'd been lucky enough in my time in McKinsey to spend a lot of time on projects that I was quite passionate about, particularly in the public sector space, so healthcare and other public sector work. And I kind of wanted an adventure, and an opportunity at that time came along to go to Ethiopia, so to work for a nonprofit that was supporting as an advisor. So I basically placed as an advisor within the Ministry of Finance in Ethiopia. But if leaving university and then going to McKinsey is kind of a natural step, like jumping to Ethiopia was obviously a complete right turn. But absolutely amazing experience. I was there for a year, learned a huge amount about both the culture, about managing people, about myself. Like, it was just amazing experience for a year. And my now wife, girlfriend Bella, was incredibly supportive of me at the time. So she was, comfortable to support me go and do that for a year, etc. When she was still based in Ireland. Amazing experience. It then came to the end of that, and I can unpack this more, but basically decided that wasn't something I wanted to keep doing. Then looked around a couple of options, looked at startup world, both, starting my own or joining a new one. Looked at doing an MBA, right? Like all of those different options. I kind of decided that none of them were really jumping out at me. So again, similar to post-university, when I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what I wanted to learn, right? And what I wanted to learn was how to manage people, how to manage teams, how to manage projects. And a very natural place to do that was back at McKinsey, right? I knew that there was an accelerated path there for me that was pretty well laid out. And when I didn't have a strong feeling on what I wanted to do, it was a very good place to learn what I wanted to learn. So I went back there, was kind of lucky enough to pretty quickly move into management. So managing teams, managing projects, and just learned a huge amount about that, and also learned that I really enjoy it, right? And I really enjoy the coaching side and both the people management, project management, and that was as much of a learning as anything, right? Because I'd obviously spent time up to that point as more of an individual contributor. I just really enjoyed that people management side, so that was kind of reaffirming that was something that I wanted to do. Project wise, I worked a lot on, very strangely, I guess for a consultant, I worked a lot on actually more in the tech space, and particularly bringing new products and to market and new strategies. There was just a series of work that was going on in London at the moment at that time at McKinsey that was interesting in that space, and I just really loved it. I loved like taking ideas from concept, launching them, thinking about how to bring them to the market, thinking about how to change strategy as you go. And then at a certain point, I would say at McKinsey, it kind of decided that what I was now learning was how to be a better consultant, right? It wasn't how to better manage people, better manage projects. And that's a point you come to in those kind of careers, right? Where you've got this massive upward trajectory where you're learning about yourself, about how to do work, about how to problem solve, how to manage teams. But then at a certain point, when you become like a more senior manager and about to become into that like path to a partner, what you're learning is how to be a good consultant, or at least that was what I felt. And that wasn't my long-term vision or path. So very open for change. And about that time, Indeed, the job recruiting company, reached out to me about a really interesting role. So they had just acquired machine learning startup in the programmatic job space. So basically placing job ads on different job boards in an intelligent way. And the role was to lead both the business and the integration of that startup as they acquired it. So just thought this was super interesting. Really loved the people that I was chatting to through the process. So decided to make the leap out of consulting into industry. And just had an amazing time at Indeed. So I joined to manage that startup, clicked really, really well with the CTO from that startup that was now the product owner for that piece of tech and software. And, to cut a long story short, essentially that small startup ended up, the principles and the tech behind that ended up being applied to Indeed's multi-billion-dollar job advertising portfolio. And through that transition, I kind of migrated with that tech and that business to then got promoted to director and kind of leading the global product commercialization, the go-to-market, the product strategy for that broader Indeed job advertising sponsored jobs product. Just an amazing kind of career step and journey, and sort of those when you get some of those like mind-blowing sort of responsibility jumps where you're kind of like, right, I was managing this couple of $1 million revenue product, and it was kind of, it can fail, it can go well. This it's kind of a very different mindset to all of a sudden multi-billion-dollar job advertising business, like the core engine of the business, and it just completely changes your perspective and what you're doing. So did that for a couple of years, really good fun, right? It was through the pandemic as well, which was just a very interesting time to be in the labor market. I really loved the company, the culture. But I would say that at a certain point, I kind of realized again, this was not what I had joined that company to do, right? So what I enjoyed launching was new products, new businesses, building teams, building projects. Moving to that larger space was a much more shepherding type role, right? It's a different space, and particularly in big tech, like mate, you get a great lifestyle, you get great compensation, you work with smart people, but for me there was like a spark missing that I had enjoyed in like my early days there, right? And there's just something different. And when you're working at that scale, your ambition becomes very personal, right? It becomes like, how do I move to the next level or get the next career promotion, right? Or how do I make sure that the work that I'm doing gets represented well? It kind of switches a little bit versus how do I make sure that the thing that I'm working on now really succeeds, right? And just, it's when you get to that scale, your ability to personally shift things like diminishes a bit, because just by the nature of anything of that scale, there's like 100 people who are extremely important to the success of that product versus the 2 or 3, right? And it's just a very different mindset. So I know I'm going a bit of a tangent here, but about that time again, I don't know if it's like, if I'm somehow mentally broadcasting when I'm like ripe for a job change. I always seem to get offers like just as I'm like thinking about it in that space. HelloFresh reached out about the role I'm currently in, and I just thought it was super interesting. It admittedly wasn't a sector that I'd been kind of monitoring, but very aware of them as a company. Loved both the mission, what they're trying to do, the trajectory, and again, really loved the people that I talked to through the process. So made the jump. Essentially, the role was to lead and launch the Irish business from scratch, very much kind of as a startup type role, right? So very independent from the global business, but again with the supports and investment structures from the global company. I would say about this time, like other things I looked at was again maybe joining an early stage startup and or again looking to find something, but the funding market wasn't great. Again, I didn't have like a real idea that I wanted to jump at, so this seemed like a pretty good option. And yeah, I've loved it. I've loved it since. So that's my path. I know taking us a long time to get here, but I'm sure we'll unpack.
Yeah, but it's good to have like the grind, because you've obviously done different things. And it's like, I think it's cool to be able to see like the transition from each to the other and like the reasoning behind it. And I actually, even though obviously I'd known the different points, the different things that you've done over those years, I hadn't thought about that common thread of actually launching new businesses and building new things, which is very obvious when you look at what you've done now. I want to talk though, so about McKinsey a little bit and consulting as a career, because you said you wanted to talk about why you think it's a good thing to do. And consultants get a lot of hate, right? I think some of it is justified for sure.
Some is incredibly deserved. There's been some terrible things. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, so there's that level of hate, but then there's which is for things that consulting companies have done, which has been very, very objectively bad. But then there's like kind of the next level down, which is just like, oh, consultants just build PowerPoint decks and don't do any work, right? Which is another level. But why do you think that consulting is actually a good place to spend some time?
Yeah, I think it's about the learning and the growth. And for me, so like you'll know this, but throughout my like school and college career, and then even for a short time immediately afterwards, one of the main things that I was involved in personally was sport, right? So is on kind of a high performance track for sailing, right? Which I know is a sport not many people will think about, but essentially on the Irish team. So like a massive amount of my time through that period was on how do I improve at sailing, right? So that was kind of what was going on in the background in my head the whole time. At a certain point, I decided that wasn't what I wanted to continue to do, right? But what I had learned, maybe both consciously at the time, but then also like really subconsciously when I look back, what I had learned most about being in that, let's say, high performance sports environment is like you are a product of the people that you spend time with, the coaches that you spend time with, and that the compounding effects of being coached well early in your career and trajectory are massive, right? Like massive. And the earlier that starts, the more it compounds and the better that you are at the end, right? So it's kind of applying those exact same concepts to your career, right? So let's say, if you look at like the amazing like tennis players or golf players, and they've been interviewed about why have they been able to achieve so much they point to like early stage coaches that they had was in their kids, right? And they're like, oh, that person got me in, that built the right mindsets, all of those things. It's never, oh, it was pretty poor and then all of a sudden I had a coach there last week and he got me great. Do you know what I mean? So early in your career, I think far more importantly than the what is the how and the coaching and the growth and the development that you can get from that. And that was certainly something that I at the time felt and saw in those graduate type programs, right? I'm like actually a really big advocate for like, once you leave college, you don't know how to work. You don't know how to do anything, right? You certainly don't know how to be in that professional environment. And unless you are someone that's got a passion and a startup idea that you want to go after, and like all power to you if you've got that, right? I think that's amazing. And you're incredibly lucky to have that passion. You should go pursue it. If you don't, invest in yourself. And a graduate program early in your career is a really good way to get a grounding in how to process things, how to manage your own time, your own day, how to break down problems, how to deal with people, whether that's internal or clients. And look, for me, it's less around consulting. I think it's a program similar to that, right? Some tech program companies will have these similar programs. As long as you are around a combination of peers who also want to continue to improve and grow, managers who want to very close coach, mentor, and teach you, and then let's say the next level up that you can look to as kind of people to inspire, mentor you, give thoughts, etc. I think that's a really good environment to be around in. And when I think about that from a sporting context, that was exactly what I sought out, right? Good training groups, right? People who could push you to be the next level, good coaches, right? And then also maybe being close to or being exposed to some of your heroes that are way ahead of you in terms of their abilities, but you can kind of see and you can model behaviors. And so applying those concepts to your profession is, I think, a really good way of thinking about it early in your career. If you don't have that passion where I'm going to take a bet and go, do X, Y, Z.
100%. I think I'm thinking about it, and I'm wondering, is there also another one which is around the processes and systems of a place, right? Because that was something that I think McKinsey has very good. Even if you replaced all the people tomorrow morning, okay, it would be a very different place, but actually these systems of like feedback and development and coaching are all still there. I think that's a big one as well. And if you're like, so I think I actually think it's a really, really good point, right? But if you're, say, in your final year of college now, everybody has a graduate program and you kind of just want a job. And so I get your point that there's a lot of value in graduate programs. And so if you're weighing up that versus something else, like maybe give a bit more weight to graduate programs because of the development and coaching that you'll get. But like, is there any way to, from the outside, try and understand which company or which area might have better development opportunities for you?
Yeah, like it's a really good question, right? And not all programs are created equal. Everyone can hire 2 or 3 people and slap a graduate program title on it. I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule there. What I will say is, if you talk to people in the organization, right, preferably ones that aren't necessarily in the recruitment space, right, who are actively trying to sell you on it. But if you can reach out to people that are either working there, talk to people that you either know, or if you don't know, like just reach out to them, right? I think that's something that I've also kind of realized. You can cold call and message people who are working in a place, and they will give you a pretty honest answer. And like you, it's then down to your intuition. And I think that if you reach out to people and talk to people and get a feel for that, what that working environment is, you'll think about, is that somewhere that I could see myself learning and growing? And I say it's personal and there isn't hard and fast rule, because again, everyone is different. Like everyone learns incredibly differently. The environment that's right for some people will be different for others. But I would really say, like, optimize in your early years for like a place that you can grow and teach, rather than even necessarily an industry that you think you want to spend the rest of your time in, right? That can always change. If you're able to do both, right? But if it's a choice between joining a place where you think you can grow, improve, enjoy your first couple of years of work, but also like really learn, versus taking a job that you don't think has that potential, but is maybe in a sector that you want to work in long term, I'd rather the first and then look to move into that sector at a later point, because I think that will put you in a much better place. Look, and that's my personal kind of experience and thoughts. Another thing I'd say is, like, everyone is incredibly different, and like we all go through life with, like, a data set of n equals 1. So we all have our own personal biases based on what worked for us or didn't work for us. But I know there's a couple of principles within there that I think are pretty good to think about.
Yep, I agree. I know that when you were leaving college, you also had a offer to go and become a trader. Was it the same considerations that made you choose like consulting over trading, that you thought you wouldn't kind of learn and develop as much, or was it something else?
I think it was a combination of a couple of things. So I think definitely that, right? I think that was definitely a consideration. I think there's also a thing, and this is something that I've always applied to every life decision, right? Is, do you really believe in the core mission of what's happening in this place, right? You don't need to be curing cancer every day, right? We don't all get that chance. But you do need to have a mission that you can say, that's pretty cool thing. I can explain that to my granny and she's going to go, good, cool, interesting, right? Even if she doesn't understand it, right? Like at its most basic, and I really do mean like at its most basic, what does the company do? And can you say that's a pretty cool thing, right? And in consulting, it's a little bit different, because some of the things they do, you can point to that, and some of the things are like, you definitely don't do that. But then they're the projects that you choose. But that was kind of what it came down to for trading for me. It was interesting work, right? They had, it was exciting, all of those things. I'm sure there was a lot of growth.
Make a stack of money.
Oh, huge, like, yeah, huge compensation awards. But it just wasn't something that I felt like I could get up every morning and go, yeah, that's it. That's what I'm doing today. And that's not like, I don't, I've got a lot of friends in the industry. It's not something that I think like, oh, all traders are heartless vultures or something like that, right? That's not the case at all. But that's very much something that you've got to set your own kind of mind to, what is something that you can get up every day and go, that's pretty cool. I'm glad that I do that, and I help that to be achieved. So that's kind of maybe another, maybe at the end of this interview we'll play back the things that have influenced my decisions, because I'm probably learning it live. But that's another big one for me, and it's one I've applied to every career decision since, where I've had different options as well. And it's far more important to me personally than like financial rewards, right? Because again, if you don't have that, you're not going to be at your best. You're not going to continue to perform. You're not going to continue to grow and improve.
Yeah, 100%. I think both of those reasons, the kind of development learning reason and the passion for the mission reason, are very like mature considerations, I would say. Like they are tough, like, especially say if you're coming out of college and you're weighing up this thing that you're not that passionate for, but it's going to pay you really, really well. Like it's hard to make that trade off. But the one thing I have found is, maybe trading is the one example that that can't be applied to this, but you will make the money back later on in your career if you if even if that is, I'm not saying this is the most important thing, but even if you're saying it is, it's like the difference in your first job of salary um is not going to be that much compared to 10 years down the road if you've learned a ton and it's something that you're actually passionate about.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, would have made a lot of money if we went into trading, but the way I kind of think about it, like, I completely agree with you. Like, and I'm a massive believer in that concept. If you're doing something that you think is like worthwhile doing, you are going to do a better job at it. You are therefore going to learn more. You're therefore going to progress more. And ultimately, again, I kind of continue to think about this like concept, like in investing, to go back to my economics and finance undergrad, the one thing I learned, that like compound interest point, right? That like small amounts of money like money invested earlier on can have massive impacts further down the line because of that compound interest principle. Apply that to your learning and your growth, right? So the differences early on, in terms of money might not be that big, but if you're compounding and learning and growing much more in one job, the trajectory that you would have been on that job that maybe you were earning more at the start, but you weren't super enjoying, so you're going to tick along and do okay at, versus the one where you're really enjoying learning, growing, and doing all those things, like the difference in those in like 20 or 30 times is just going to be like incomparable. So again, I think it's really important that people weigh up and think about those in the right way. And I completely agree with you. I think for your first job out of college, money should be like a consideration. You've always got to make sure you're being rewarded the right way, and you're okay with that. But there are much more important things to consider, I would say, early on in career. And again, like we're both retrospectively applying this. We weren't that consciously thinking about this when we're coming out of college, but if someone is listening to this like early on in their career, I would really encourage you to think about what's something that you're going to enjoy doing and you feel you can grow it and improve at. And if that means turning down some money to go and do that, like that's a very worthwhile trade-off, in my opinion.
I feel like you're a lot more thoughtful picking your job at college than I was. I picked it because I got to wear a nice suit, and it actually did pay pretty well. So I was like, okay, I'm sold.
Good expenses policy.
Yeah, exactly. Um, when you were at McKinsey, both before you went to Ethiopia and then afterwards when you came back, you you performed well and you got promoted like pretty quickly, right, by all kind of benchmarks. Why do you think you did well?
Can I be honest? The biggest thing is luck.
Oh, that's bullshit. That's a bullshit answer.
No, I'll explain like the things that set me up well.
Okay, I'll give you that one, but then you have to give me a second one.
Yeah, no, like let me just to build on it. Like, so And there's a lot of things in life, right? You've got to have a little bit of luck and then be set up well to take advantage of the luck. But I know other people that were not, let's say, progressing as fast as me, that I feel were just as competent. But anyway, put the luck aside, which is always a big thing. I think a couple of things that, let's say, I think particularly when I moved to the management stage, helped me, and maybe less so in the early stages, is that I really, really enjoy working with and coaching and managing people, right? And even from these days, let's say before you get promoted to manager, they were always opportunities that I sought out and put my hand up for, and trying to mentor someone coming onto the team or something like that. And really, it's just something that I kind of enjoy. Do you know what I mean? And again, like seeking out things that you enjoy, like that's something that gives me a lot of energy. And for some of these roles, that's very helpful because you need to do a lot of it, right? And that kind of sets me up well to look forward to come into work each day, right? And trying to manage and coach that person, because it's something that I actually enjoy. A second one is more on the people side. Is that I don't know. I feel like I was able to make good relationships and friends with like clients, right? And then people more senior than me as well. I think that's something that maybe some people, when they come into those kind of fresh environments, kind of forget, is that these are all people, right? And even if someone has got like 5 or 6, 7 years more experience with you, it doesn't make them a different type of person, right? They can still like bond with you over things. You can still tell them problems. You can tell them your doubts. You can explain mistakes to them.
So after your first stint at McKinsey, about 2 years or so, that's when you made the call. You wanted to go a bit of an adventure, something different, go to Ethiopia. I'm sure you have so many stories from that. I've heard some of them. But what I'm most interested in is, what do you think were the biggest differences between the Philip who left Ireland to go to Ethiopia and the Philip who came back a year later?
You can maybe unpack some of the why, but there was definitely a maturity, I would say, that wasn't necessarily there before, which I think is the biggest one. I think when you spend time in an environment, in a developing country, right, with an incredibly different both economic situation, living situation, culture, you just like, without doing too much, you just change, and you, in my opinion, you mature. You get a better perspective on both life and yourself, and what you want to do personally. Yeah, it just like there was a maturity there. Like, I mean, one of the reasons that I went to Ethiopia, or not one of the reasons, but I remember when I was trying to make the decision at the time, I was talking to a bunch of kind of my mentors, and I actually can't remember who said this one, but it was a piece of advice that I've actually really tried to live to a lot of the time. And it was, when you're thinking about a decision like that, take the one that you think makes you a more interesting person, right? And it's not one I've always been able to apply, but there's just something there about looking for experiences and life experiences that certainly enrich you as a person and your personality, that kind of build you into a more rounded human, and are also experiences that you can look back on and say, that was something both interesting and something I'm super proud of, and that you think is having a positive impact on the world and all that. But that was a piece of advice that I got before, and I want to kind of think about it now, but it was probably true coming back. I don't mean more interesting in like, at dinner conversations, I've got loads of stories to tell. Right. I mean in more so in the case of like more to you as a person, right? Like a depth that probably wasn't there before. And that's not to say, went to Ethiopia and found myself, right? Nothing so dramatic as that, but it's more just a continuous build. And I think if you've got an opportunity to really work, like to really, really work outside of your cultural comfort zone, it's a really good thing to do. Not always easy to do, but I think it's a really good thing to do.
Why do you think that people can kind of learn or change so much when they're working in a place that's like so culturally different?
I think without knowing it, we probably spend most of our times working with and around people who are pretty close to ourselves, right? And there might be, big superficial personality differences, but if you've grown up in a, Western culture environment in Europe, the US, Australia, you've watched the same shows, you've listened to the same like music, you're in the same like cultural zeitgeist, if you like. There are commonalities of understanding between you, even if like superficially different backgrounds or even different like socioeconomic backgrounds within those countries and all of those things. There's an understanding between you, right? That when you go somewhere like in Ethiopia, right, it's just completely different, both, values, life understanding, culture, what they prioritize. It's just completely different. And when you spend time working with people like that, and I worked with some absolutely amazing people, I think even subconsciously you begin to kind of understand and notice things about both yourself in a way that is you probably don't get if you're just constantly working with people that are somewhat similar to you. So it's like, I'm a massive believer in bringing together a diverse range of opinions, thoughts, and life experiences into a team, right? It's super important. But if you go to somewhere like Ethiopia at the time, like it's an extreme level of diversity, right? Like people who think about life just completely different to you, even the ones that are, let's say even people who are working jobs that are quite similar to what you're doing, right? And so I had a lot of, both reported into and worked with Ethiopians that just had a very different perspective on like what was important to them, and the way that they approach problems, the way they approached conflict, and just very different, right? And it's I wouldn't even necessarily be able to say exactly what those differences are and point to them, and but just you're aware that you're in a different cultural environment to what you've grown up and been used to, and that pushes you out of a comfort zone, and I think it helps you to grow a little bit in ways that you probably don't even understand at the time. But like increasingly I look at it and think that I took a lot out of that experience.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I'm thinking even on a smaller level, right? Like when we went to the US for a summer, okay? Now, it's still a Western, largely white society. In fact, probably more Western and more white than even where we grew up, right? Um, but you get exposed to like these different people living different lives, like prioritizing different things, and I think it either makes it makes you go, oh, everybody doesn't think like I do. So and these are also, and now I'm exposed to them. I'm working very closely with them. You get to know them. They become something other than like, oh, some story I read on Facebook, right? Or a book that I read. And it's like, no, like here's a real person with a very, very different real worldview to what I have, prioritizing different things, and seeing that up close is very different.
Yeah, and they see the world in a different way, and like you realize then when you see that at the extremes, you realize that on a micro level, that's every single person, right? We've all got those slightly different experiences, and we see the world and like have filters and values that are slightly different. I think helping to understand that gives you a different perspective on dealing with and getting to know people. So I think there's a lot of benefits in having those different exposures. Like just this is not a business one, but it's maybe a good point of like how different people can experience the world. So a good friend that I had out there, we were talking about different, let's say ways of eating, right? So obviously in Ireland, we eat with a knife and fork, right? You would almost never, other than something that comes in like a bread roll or like a wrap, you would never, eat like a stew with your hands. Okay. So, and my Ethiopian friend was explaining that to them, the tasting the food through their hands is an experiential part of eating, right? In a way that they don't get when they eat with a knife and fork, right? They're like missing a taste element of that food, right? And that was kind of like little bit like mind blowing to me. So like, outside of that, right, which is obviously a very different example to business, but you can think like that's a completely different way and perspective of looking at life. And if you think about like something as extreme as that, then applied to everyday things, like what happens if, something goes wrong at work, right? Again, if you've got someone coming from a very different cultural background, they're coming to that with a very different perspective. So likewise, and if you take that down to the micro level, someone that's not you comes with a very different perspective. And I think understanding that is a really helpful thing to get your head around.
I can see that for sure. Like just having, it's like empathy, but on, I was going to say on an extreme scale, but it's actually on all scales, right? So it's like empathy for people who are like completely different to you, but then also empathy for somebody who you think might be the exact same as you, but they could be looking at the same problem in a very, very different way.
Yeah, exactly that. So, look, we're going around in a long way from the original question, but it's kind of, I think that was the main thing that I took from it, was that the perspective is that there are people in the world with very different ways of looking at the world than me. And I think that is true at the extreme, right? Where you come from a different part of the world, a different culture. And it's also true at the micro, where you and I grew up in the same, we grew up in the same street, went to the same play school, went to the same primary school, same secondary school, for the listeners to explain the depth of understanding. Same college. We then did the same first job out of work. I would say we have very different ways of looking at the world.
We lived together for a while.
Yeah, we lived together. Yeah, we both did like similar sports. We were on the same sports teams growing up. We have very different ways of viewing the world, I would say. So like that's, if that's possible with like that, pretty close cultural similarity, you can imagine the diversity of opinion out there in the world.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Okay, so to pick back up on kind of the storyline. So you come back from Ethiopia, you work at McKinsey. I kind of want to skip forward a little bit to the HelloFresh piece, because I think that's super interesting. I want to talk a bit more about that. So you work at McKinsey, you leave, you work at Indeed, and then you leave Indeed, like a senior, really good position at Indeed, but you leave to become the CEO of HelloFresh in Ireland, right? How does that even happen? Like, were you perusing the internal job board at Indeed? Do you get some sort of special access at Indeed to the CEO jobs that nobody else sees? Like, honestly, I'm actually genuinely interested.
The special jobs, we keep them for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. But how does that even happen? Like, what's the process for kind of interviewing for that type, or from the very start, right, to actually getting the job? What does that process look like for that job?
At least in my case, it was a headhunter, right? It was a recruiter, that third party recruiter that reached out to me. And you get these like, quite often, right? When you get to a certain point in your career, you'll be well aware as well. You get a lot of LinkedIn reach outs, right? Like with different jobs. But this one was particularly interesting. So I kind of took the call, right? That first approach is you get a message that says, would you be interested in this? Decided to take the call. Was a really interesting both job, kind of role, career, company, all of those things that sort of said, okay, this is pretty interesting. The next level is then you'll typically get a conversation with someone pretty senior within the organization, not necessarily an interview, but like a kind of a conversation more where it's a little bit more you telling them about yourself and them telling you about the company, right? That they're still pitching you at that stage to a certain extent. I then decided it was something that I wanted to do, right? So you then go through the full application process, and then had a series of, both interviews, presentation, pitches that I made to the senior leadership there, like the global senior leadership, and ultimately, got the job. But it kind of starts with that direct reach out. Yeah, that it's often then I wasn't in the job market necessarily before that. Do you know what I mean? I wasn't searching job boards looking at jobs. Now, as it happened at exactly the same time, there was another company that was also talking to me about a role as well. So I kind of had 2 or 3 jobs that I could compare and think about. But yeah, that was kind of how the process went.
How long was it from kind of initial reach out to contract signed?
3 or 4 months. Yeah. It's a long process. It's a long process because you've got that initial courting phase, right? And then the interview stage is really in depth. You're talking about like 6-7 interviews, and typically a pitch or presentation to a committee or something like that. So in my case, it was to like the kind of members of the global leadership SLT. In some ways, it's really helpful, right? Because by the time you get to the end, you have a very good perspective if this is something you want to do or not, right? Versus say, early in your career, sometimes you can apply for a job and within a week or within 2 weeks, you've got an offer or a turn down, and you haven't really had the time to think about, is this actually something I want to do? So look, it's definitely a long process. And in my experience, the further you progress in your career, the longer those processes become, because obviously for the company, the risk factor of hiring someone wrong goes up. So yeah, it was an enjoyable process, but definitely a long one. But the benefit being that you've got a pretty good perspective on the company.
Yeah, that's true. It was obviously a decent amount of work as well, right? Like you're kind of preparing for every interview, especially if you're doing presentations. Like that's actually proper work. Was there anything that you did during that process that you think really helped your chances? Maybe a non-obvious thing other than preparing and doing a good job.
It's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a lot of it is just work and prep and research. You've got to give up a lot of weekends, right? Because you're still doing your core job. One that I felt very beneficial to me was I got a lot of input. Like at that stage in your career, you've typically built up a good network of both peers and mentors. I got a lot of input from those, both from people like at Indeed, right, at the company that I was leaving, and then also people from previous jobs, peers. So like I remember getting you on the call for an hour, going through things. And that's a really helpful thing to me, because I remember it's not something that I would have done in previous job applications. And it feels very, you come into your own space and you this personal echo chamber where you're thinking about what are my strengths or my weaknesses. Whereas getting that feedback from different people who've worked with you, who know you well, I think is really helpful. So that first of all, to come up with like a pretty well-rounded view of why you should or shouldn't be getting this job, right? And you're able to articulate that. And then in terms of, let's say, the kind of more presentation and strategy side of things, again, if you were doing this in a company or in a business, you wouldn't go into a dark room for a weekend and emerge with a PowerPoint deck, right, on XYZ. You'd spend a time within a team, you'd be problem solving it, you'd be iterating it. So I got a lot of input from friends, from kind of mentors that I've had, from Bella, my wife, who's amazing at kind of looking at things and finding different ways. Again, exactly what you do in a business, right? You'd be in a team, you'd workshop it, you'd go through several iterations of it. Applying those same principles to putting your best version of yourself forward in the job application is quite helpful. Not something that I did massively previously. It's definitely something that, if I'm ever in a position to change jobs again, I'd apply exactly the same principles.
Yeah, I think it does require a bit more vulnerability though, because at the most basic level, you're going to your friends and saying, "Hey, I'm applying for this job," which means that if you don't get it, you have to let them know you didn't get it. Whereas, like, if you applied for a job on your own, you never have to tell anybody. You just go through the process. If you get it, great, you tell everyone. If not, well, hey, nobody ever knew. So it's a bit more daunting, because I've done it as well, like a couple of times, and you're kind of like, oh, I don't want to tell them, but the benefit is huge if you can get over that.
And then even things like, say for example, where you've got a presentation or something as part of that process, right, where you've had to prep something personally, putting that up to like your friends or your peers who you respect, and them saying that doesn't really make sense. Do you know what I mean? It like, it cuts much more personally than in a work context, right, where it's kind of naturally happening. So yeah, I think that's maybe why I wouldn't have done it more in the past, right? Is that opening yourself up to vulnerabilities. And you kind of want to emerge at the end with like the ticket and say, I have the job, and then tell people about it. As you say, telling people about it mid-process requires a lot more, both vulnerabilities and probably embracing a bit of like humbleness as well, right? That you don't have all the answers, and you need some support and help. So yeah, that's very, very true. Very true.
Yeah, I know it's a big one. Like I've worked with, or kind of mentored like some people earlier in their career who are like going through the process of like looking for jobs and whatever else, and they seem often very unwilling to ask for help. They're like, "No, I got to do this on my own," and I'm like, "What do you mean? Like, you know how everybody gets jobs, and the more so as you get older." Is by asking for help, whether that's basic stuff like, using your network to get an introduction to even get an interview or helping you through the process or whatever else. It's like, nobody does this on their own as they get older, especially not the ones who actually end up getting the jobs. And it's just a different mindset shift, I think. I know earlier you were saying like every day is very different, right? But if we could pick a day, I don't know if there's a day last week that you could kind of just talk me through a bit so that we have some sense, because it's obviously, I think for a lot of people, CEO, he's sitting up there in the corner office, um shaking hands and kissing babies and cutting ribbons, but like what do you actually do?
Yeah, yeah. So I can talk you through a. I don't know if I can even remember a single day, but a pretty typical one, or an example day in the life of. Wake up, typically go into the office. We do hybrid working, but I try to be in the office a lot of the time. Um, don't have a corner office. I sit down with everyone else, and this is actually one that I increasingly find with leaders in companies. I remember seeing this in consulting as well. Like the idea that the CEO sits off in a corner office is like it's almost becoming outdated, and increasingly they're in like this open plan. So definitely in my case. When I get in, I'll typically do the usual: check emails, check Slacks, make sure nothing major is changed or changing. Then I'll spend a lot of the start of my day looking at data and insights into both the business, both from an operation perspective, how we're performing, are we producing our product in a good way, customer perception of that product, which is just the most important thing in a direct to consumer business, particularly a subscription direct to consumer business. Are you continuing to produce an amazing product for your customers? So that's number one. Our marketing performance. There's a bunch of those different metrics that I will check literally every morning, like how we're performing on. And it's one of the big things, a slight difference maybe from me coming from a more B2B type business background, where when you've got sales as a mediator between yourself and the customer, there's another channel that you can go to for additional information, feedback, customer perceptions. It's a slightly different approach. When you're in direct to consumer, you've really got to lean into the data and make sure that you're understanding that. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, right? And I typically come away from those with a bunch of either questions or priorities that I know that I need to look into either for the day or for the next couple of days and for the week. And that can be either trends or it can be one-off events that I can see. So that's a really big part of it. And also when you're particularly in a growing stage of a business, kind of similar to a startup, that's not something that you can have like an analyst go and do and then bring you what they think are the right things. Because ultimately that's the job, right? You need to know that in depth. You need to get it, for want of a different word. And that's something that I in the past have seen the leaders that I like, let's say, aspire to be similar to. They really understand their business. They really understand the data. They are able to get into the weeds of it. You're not always able to do it, but I think that's a different approach to, let's say, you get a report once a week on how the business is doing with some, trends emerging and leads and nice, pretty slides. I find it's not enough detail to come to the right decisions. Then I'll spend a lot of my day typically in like one-to-ones with my leadership team, digging into both sharing priorities from my perspective based on those insights that I've got, and then also problem solving particular topics that they've got or their team members have got. That's a big part of it. You've got to remember as well when you're in that, let's say, towards the at kind of the center of any organization, and it can be of any size, right? You are the one person that's got the perspective over all of those different teams and areas. So a really big part of it as well is tying together those interdependencies across the different teams and making sure that the product team knows what the marketing team is doing and thinking, and the operations team is linked up with that as well, and all of those things, they happen organically, right? An amazing team that they work incredibly well together. But again, there's a perspective that you get being at that kind of helicopter level, right, where you can see things that is very hard to see when you're in those different teams. And having been in, let's say, the equivalent of one of those teams at my previous role and my previous jobs, right, where I didn't have perspective over the whole business, I now see a lot of things that I wouldn't have seen before. So that's a big part of it. They're kind of the two or three things that like I do every day, right? Like, so check in with the teams, check in with how business is progressing. Then there'll be other things that'll happen to me one-off. So I'll spend a bit of time, or often spend time at our production site, right? I don't come from a production background, so it is not that I can look at an assembly line and say we need to tweak this, this, and this. But what I can do is, even just by being there, is give additional kind of sounding boards and problem solving topics to my production team, our production head of production. You can build good relationships with other partner companies that you work with and maybe at that site. And there's also, just again, because you've got that slightly different perspective, you can see things that is difficult to see if you are stuck in, or not stuck in, but your mindset is focused on one particular thing and like laser focused on one thing as it has to be. Again, you can maybe see different things. So I spend a lot of time there. And then the other things that come up more sporadically are like conversations with partners, suppliers, all of those things, right? And building those and holding those relationships, because again, you are for better or for worse, the face of that organization. So you've often got to hold some of those relationships.
It seems like a lot of relationships where whether it's people management, right? Like the people who are on your leadership team and working with them, or partners, or whatever. Like, it does feel like it's a very heavy people role.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. You've got to be very comfortable at building and holding relationships, because another part of the job as well then is, I guess similar to investors at a startup or a board, I've also got to hold really good relationships with the parent company, right, with HelloFresh Global, both for to make sure that we are getting the benefits of global best practices, changes that we're making, learnings from other markets, right, in terms of what works well for consumers that we can apply here. Also making sure that ultimately, because making sure they're comfortable with the financial progress of the market, all of those things. It's a lot of relationship building. It's a lot of really understanding what drives different people, different partners, all of those things. So yeah, it's a really big part of it. It's not the only part though, and that's a part where the hardest part for me maybe to do it in this role is that you have to do all of that, plus you've got to really understand the business, the product. You can't switch off your head just because you're the one. Yeah, so it's definitely learning how to balance those things. So managing your team members, making sure that they're aligned on what you're driving towards, making sure that other people within the organization are kind of supporting your team as well. And then also more broadly that, partners are doing the right thing. Like all of those things is a big part of it. And that's like a big people draw. But fundamentally, you've also got to like run a business, right? Like it's not like you switch it on and it just keeps going away in the background as long as you can keep it ticking. There are real problems to solve. Your brain has got to switch on. There's a lot of decisions to make.
I feel like you really like that part of it. The way people say like, oh, I like solving problems. Like I feel like you, even talking about them now, you're kind of getting excited. Like,
yeah, no, I definitely do. I think it's something I've always really enjoyed, right? Is that identifying a problem, particularly like a customer problem, right? You get like just a really good buzz out of it. And then working with people to realize it, right? Like when you get to the level that I'm at the moment, there are very few problems that you can solve by yourself, right? Like very, very few. There's very few problems that you can even fully understand by yourself, right? You've got to be working typically with your team So that's the part that I really enjoy. Like I really enjoy that, like debating, teasing things out, the real kind of, stuck in a room and thinking about a problem and bringing it to a solution, and then seeing the impact of that. And that's like independent of like the role or job that I'm doing. It's something I just really enjoy. And I think it's that, because for me, it's that combination of two things I really enjoy, like the sort of like, thrill of like solving something. I have you now, I have it sorted. And then also working with people to impact it. I think it's just a combination of two things that I get a lot of energy from. Like I really get a lot of energy from, and it's something that I try to build into my time and in a way that allows me to continue to get that energy, because ultimately that's what's going to drive out the best solutions for the business, and then ultimately what's most important, the best product for the customer, that they're getting an amazing service. So yeah, I really enjoy that.
I really miss that from McKinsey. That like problem solving in a room with a bunch of people. Um, I really and even like doing it in person, like physically versus virtually. I just found like I really enjoy that like collaborative problem solving. Maybe it's just like how I do it, but it's like I want to throw around ideas. Like they mightn't be good, but just like somebody argue with me about them, and then we'll get to a good answer. And I found like, especially now as I'm doing a bit more work on my own, I really miss that, because I'm like, I have an idea, but it's like I want somebody to tear this idea apart and tell me why it's stupid, because then I might get to a better idea instead. So I can see where you enjoyed that side of it. Do you ever find it stressful?
I mean, for me, it's different, right? Like, because I've read things on that as well. I wouldn't say that I was personally super stressed, but was able to deal with it. I would say that like a step before that, I didn't feel super stressed. Do you know what I mean? And I think that this is almost about how you define your sense of self. Like most of my, let's say, self worth or whatever you want to call it, like how I define me, I don't honestly don't derive from work, right? Like work is like a really interesting part of my life, and it's a huge part of my life. You go to work for a lot of the time, but if I think about the things of whether I would be like content, not content, stressed, not stressed, happy with who I am as a person or not happy with who I am as a person, a lot of things I can think of before it's work, right? It's making sure that I'm spending time with my friends, making sure that I'm getting to see my family, making sure that like a massive part of it is that like Bella, my wife, and I are content, have a good life, all of those things. You can disassociate yourself from work to a certain extent, and then work is like, okay, it's a job, and the stakes could be really high in the job, and you might be, you can go further and further in the job and all those things, but I wouldn't say that it's that different to when I don't feel it that differently to, let's say, when I started. And like maybe that's something that I've got naturally. I actually think that I probably got it more from sport, right? So because I would have done like an individual sport growing up. Did team sports as well, but spent a lot of time, as you know, doing individual like sailing and competing for championships abroad and all of those things. And there are sometimes where you do really well, and sometimes where you do really, really badly. And sometimes there's luck involved, right? It's not always something that you've done, and you've got to become very comfortable that if I'm finishing first or second, or if I'm finishing 34th at a world championships or a European event or something like that, that doesn't mean that I am a 34th, 34 times worse person than when I finished first, right? And honestly, I struggled with that initially, I would say, like through my early stages, or not early stages, but let's say through like my teenage years doing sport like that. I found that my sense of self-worth was really defined by how well I was doing at that thing, right? Naturally kind of competitive person, wanted to make sure that I was, putting my best foot forward, all of that. And kind of, over time learned that that was just a part of me, right? And the success or failure there is not something that I've got to really define my life by. And I think being able to, and over time, like I learned, like with the like sports psychology on this as well, learning to separate the results and the process and all of those things from your kind of emotional state through that just allowed me to enjoy it much more, right? And again, I think, kind of back to the point of, is this something that I've learned, always had? I wonder if maybe some of that experience was a really helpful toolkit to then apply to the business world, where things can go well and things can go badly, and it's dependent on decisions that you make, right? And I think it just equipped me with a good toolkit for that going forward. But that's all learnable, right? And I think if someone is doesn't necessarily have that from earlier in the career, again, learning how to define your sense of success, not success, separately to some of the decisions you make, some of the career steps you take, what happens to you in your career is really important, I think. Or certainly, again, like everyone's different, but I certainly found it very helpful to then be able to go into those very stressful situations, because you're able to keep quite even.
You do strike me like from the outside, right? And you could tell me this is wrong, but from the outside, you strike me as somebody who is always been very good at dealing with stress, and now even better, right? Like, you can correct me if that's wrong, because that's just like my outside in perspective. But like, is that true? And if so, do you think some of that is just natural? Like, some people are kind of just a bit better at dealing with it, or is there elements of it that actually, you've implemented certain things that help you with it? Genuinely interested, like, for my own sake as well.
Yeah, definitely, right? It's a stressful job. I would say that said, I don't think that it is any more. I've experienced any more stress than like previous jobs or previous roles. That is maybe because I'm better at dealing with it, right? Rather than there's less stressful situations. But when you move from that role where you've got someone managing you, right? And that you can be pretty senior and still have that, right? But in this role, like, there's no one, let's say, that is thinking about what I do day to day. There's just a very different level of responsibility that comes with that, and that comes with a lot of additional stress. So you are making decisions where you are the final decision maker, and the success or not success of something is going to depend on that decision. That 100% comes with more stress. And you're always trying to make them for the right reason, right? You're trying to, create a better product for the customer. You're trying to make sure the business is growing in the right way, right? The intent is there, but ultimately you've got to make a decision at some point. And that is stressful.
No, 100%. Because I think there's like, as you said, there's a couple of sides of it, but like, one is, are you able to not let stress affect your performance, right? Whether that's decision making or anything else. I think the other one is like, what is my experience of life given this stress, right? Because, for example, you could talk to athletes. I don't know, Johnny Wilkinson is always an example. He felt huge amounts of stress, anxiety around his job. He was able to deal with them in a way that didn't affect his performance. He would perform really well. But if you listen to interviews with him, he's like, I wasn't having a good time. Like, that wasn't enjoyable for me, right? So do you think about that other side of it as well, or is that something that's just not really a thing for you?
It's funny, like, this is something that I've heard, like, other people have said to me as well, right? Like, you seem very calm, not stressed, etc. I think the first thing I'll say is, there's a difference between not stressed and not showing you're too stressed, right? That's a big one. But that said, I do think I probably have developed a good ways of dealing with stressful situations. And I don't know. Look, I don't know if that's something that I've always had, or if it's something that I've kind of built better over time. Do you know the way sometimes with skills like that, when it's not like a switch is flicked, it's hard to know, have I always been like that, or is that just something that the situation that I've been in have developed me? I think if we're trying to self-reflect, I think being able to disassociate yourself and your sense of self-worth and personal risk from the decisions that you're making is part of it, right? So if there's a very stressful, like quote unquote, situation at work, I think I'm able to say that that is a stressful situation at work, right? That is not me. Do you know what I mean? And that allows you to stay much more calmer about the situation and approach it in a much more thoughtful, methodical way. It's not that you don't get, it's not that you're trying to take emotions out of it, right? Because I actually think that's important, but more the success or failure of this decision doesn't mean that I am a success or failure.
It's a really interesting perspective on it, right? Because when I think about, say, the unfortunate thing is, I think that having your self-worth tied up in something can drive you to do really well at it to a point, right? And I'm speaking from personal experience here, of course, right? So it's like it can if you really think, oh my God, for me to enjoy life and be content, I have to do well at this thing, right? It's going to create a lot of stress for you, but it's also going to make you go and try really hard to be good at it because it's what you care about so much. And so it can actually drive you, and you can get away with it for quite a while because it's self-reinforcing. And if somebody was like, well, maybe you shouldn't tie your self-worth to like your performance in your job, you might go, okay, sure, but look at it all that has got me, that belief has got me. So it's like, it can be hard to let go, but then I think, it's very difficult to take it to whatever that next level of performance is, whether it's job, sport, or whatever else, because then it just gets all tied up in this whole stress and mix of emotions where, if you really want to perform at that top level, you probably can't be doing that and still have it. So it's interesting that, like, to really do well, you actually have to care a bit less than maybe how much you care to get there.
It's really true. Like it's really, really true. And I think that the only thing I would say on that is, I think it's not necessarily the caring less, right? Because you can still really, really, really want the thing, right? I know, and I know that when you're in something that you're really focused on and you want to achieve, like you can really, really want that thing, but there's almost a stage where you sort of got to trust in the steps that you've taken, in the process that you've taken, that in yourself as a person that you've done the right things. And then sometimes things go wrong. Like sometimes things don't happen for you, but that doesn't mean that, if you're defining, I think if you're defining, let's say, your self-worth by the success or failure of that thing, means if it's successful, great, right? And that like self-reinforces that point, right? And you drive on for the next thing and it's successful. But then if you get a failure and you get like a real knock, your confidence is shot. Very difficult to build back up, very difficult to like apply the right processes and structures and, making the right decisions. Whereas if you can kind of separate that a little bit, it allows you to much more clear-headedly focus on what you're doing, take the right decisions, adapt to things that happen, because so much of life is honestly like luck. And yeah, I think it's important. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a really interesting thing to talk about, and it's one that I certainly took a lot from like sports psychology around it. Because exactly as you say, you can care really deeply about something, but at a certain point, if that's all consuming, it's probably detrimental to what you're trying to achieve.
On a slightly different point, right? So when people would think of somebody, the classic person in your kind of role, right? They probably think that they spend all their time in work, thinking about work, everything else. And you obviously do work hard, but I think people would probably be surprised by the amount of what I would call quote unquote balance that you have in your life, like all the other things, like the pastimes, different places, whether it's music or sailing or sport or just friends and families and vacations, whatever else it is. Like you seem to have a very strong balance across all those things. Is that something that you are very conscious of creating, or is it something that's just kind of naturally how you live your life?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's something that I think about a lot. I think it is quite conscious, and I would probably say that I think sometimes people falsely view it as a binary, right? I need to take away from work to make time for life. Do you know what I mean? Like that's constantly something we're talking about, like the work-life balance situation. It's, oh, you've got to, uh, make sure that you're, even if it means that you're sacrificing a bit of work, you've got to make time for, personal life, all of those things. For me, again, particularly in my experience, the thing that helps me to do well at my job is to make good decisions, right? Like most fundamentally, it's that you are thinking about things clearly. You are making good decisions. That happens when you're in a personally happy place, right? So I don't see it as a binary. It's something that like I certainly prioritize in my life, making sure that I'm getting enough time to spend with Bella, enough time to spend with friends, spend with family, etc. Yes, because I want to do all of those things, right? Like that's the reason that I do them. But when I think about it if you're thinking about it from a pure work perspective, that is a helpful thing, right, for you to do well at your job as well, because you feel more balanced. You're not feeling burnt out. You're feeling energized from having spent times doing the things and passions that you like to do outside of work. So for me, it's not a binary. I think it's actually a really important part of what makes you a good person, and therefore what makes you good at what you do at your job as well. And there are some people, look, who like that passion and those things that they enjoy maybe is the job, right? And they do want to spend all of the times at work, right? And I think sometimes that's demonized to the other side, but it's definitely something that consciously I know I am better at work if I have got to spend time playing sports, if I've got to, cook dinner with my wife in the evenings, got to spend time with my family. And that's not to say I don't work long hours and hard. Sometimes really do, and you prioritize it and you do that. But I think again, just on the balance of things, making sure that you're making time for those things outside of work, I don't think takes away from your work. I actually think it makes you a better, long term, makes you a better, more productive person to have a job as well.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that's a unique but very accurate way of actually looking at things. And you're right. A lot of people think it's binary, and I have to take from one to give to the other, and that's it. I've got probably two more questions for you. Right. So the next one's is a bit, it's a bit, perhaps a bit of a tricky one. So actually, not even sure if you'll have an answer for this, but I'm just interested because I want to know. Right. As you, the question is basically, do you kind of have a life philosophy, for want of a better word, or structure for how you think about living like a good, happy life? Primarily in the terms of like how you make decisions, right? Like if you were making a decision, whether it's job or otherwise, is there anything that you think, well, okay, is this going to, how do you think through those decisions on a very macro level? Do you have like a life philosophy that you can kind of go back to? It's like, well, that's not aligned with this, so I probably shouldn't do it.
I think it's a really, really tough question, which is exactly what this podcast is for. So it's good. I don't know that I've got one single neat life philosophy that I could put on the front page of like a business book. Wish I did. But when I look back, I do think I've got a couple of like principles that I've certainly applied to decisions that I think is helpful. Some of them are like honestly blatantly contradictory, but I deal with that as well. I think the first one, like that one about, that I told you that piece of advice, or like pick the job that you feel makes you a more interesting person, is actually really important, because that's a subjective definition, right? What's interesting to some people is different to others, but it forces you to pick things that you are interested in and passionate about, rather than what like the world or like the cultural definition of what that is at the time, right? So and for me, that's changed over time. Do you know what I mean? What I felt was very interesting when I moved to Ethiopia was to go and work in Ethiopia and do those things, right? When I took this job, it was to be building a business and But again, it kind of forces you to think like, what am I actually like really interested in at the moment? And I think sometimes when you think about when it's couched in language that's too flowery around your passion or your dream or your goal, it's so lofty that you're never going to find it, right? But if you've got like a couple of decisions to go with, what do you think is going to make in your opinion, like you an interesting, more interesting person, that pushes you to like maybe take some decisions that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I've certainly found it pushed me to do decisions that I wouldn't have otherwise, right? So again, that's maybe one. I've got a couple of others that are maybe less fleshed out or intuitive, but I'll chat through with you. So this is one that like I'm increasingly thinking about. Have you heard of the concept called like the hedonic treadmill?
Yes, but explain it.
So for those that don't know, this is a concept that after major positive or negative life changes or events, your happiness can return to a mean level, right? That's what the concept is. I remember reading about this, probably like sitting in like a dentist, read it in like a magazine or something like that. I haven't explored it any more than that surface level, right? I haven't like read research on it. I haven't, listened to it or anything like that. But I found it's really like spoken to me, and I've actually like thought about it quite a lot. And the way that I interpret it, right, which is probably not even the original meaning of it, is that if you're trying to find like life satisfaction and happiness, it is not through events or circumstantial changes. It's a separate path that you go on to find. And the kind of the extreme examples that people list are things like, if you win the lottery or if you lose a leg, right, your happiness can return to the same level. And whether or not it's true, I don't know, but it is something that I think about when I think about decisions. I am not chasing something that I think is going to make me happier, right? Because I honestly don't think that that's necessarily the way to think about that. There's all sorts of reasons to pick interesting careers, right? And be engaged, making sure that you're kind of contented. But in terms of, your day-to-day and like medium-term life satisfaction, that's something that I honestly think can be the same if you're doing, basically any job, but there's something that you've got to find in a different journey within yourself. And that's certainly a journey that I've gone on, but it's a separate journey to my career. Like it really is. And I think, again, maybe it's back to this like stress point that if you can, to a certain extent, identify that your life is not tied up in that career decision, the success failure of that decision is, becomes a little bit easier to take, right? Because I know that if this goes well or if it doesn't go well, I can still come home, sit down on the couch, watch Netflix with Bella, have a great time, right? Or I can still think about myself and evaluate myself in the same way. So I don't know if that's how the concept is like actually out there in the world, but that's what I take from it. And I have found it really helpful.
Yeah, I think I really like that because I think if you think of like two different ends of the scale of hedonic adaptation, right? So one is that like, okay, I'll be happy when I get a new car, right? And then you get the car and it's great for a week and you're like, oh, fine, I'm just back to my mean happiness, right? Which I think people can probably intuit or maybe understand a bit more, even though it's still real. But then there's also a bigger one, which is like, I'll be happy when, I have this job, and I get married, right? And people probably believe that one a lot more, right? And I can totally see why. But we say, but actually, it probably extends to a lot of those things as well. And so like, yeah, it just feels like you more have to. And it's like I'm thinking about this right now, right? Because when I'm going through the process of trying to figure out what I want to do next, right? And a lot of it is based on decision making. And go, okay, well, all I need to do is find the perfect job for me, and then everything will fall into place. And I'll have this wonderfully contented life, right? Whereas, like, has that ever happened in the past? No, of course not, right? Like, I thought that in college. It's like if I could just get a job at McKinsey, wouldn't my life just every day would be a 10 out of 10? It's like, no, no, of course not. Like,
and the thing about it, like, if you want to get even deeper, is like, it's very helpful for society that people believe that, right? Because you're always pushing and chasing the next big thing. You're, working those extra hours. You're taking that job that maybe you don't want to because you think it will get you to that point, and all of those things, right? Because that's when I'll get happy. Like the whole concept, like the pursuit of happiness, right? That happiness is an object or event that can happen, and then, right, I have it now, happy. And I really don't think that's how it works. I think that you can go on that journey, like separately entirely to where you're living, like, how much you're earning, what your job is. All of those things are cool, right? Like they're things that you need to think about really thoughtfully, and you've got to think things that, overall, it's not to say that we can all just sit back and not take any life decisions because it's not going to change our happiness, right? That's not, and I think, necessarily what it is. It's more that there's a separate journey you've personally got to go on within yourself to think, like, what is going to make me content? How do I think about myself? And I don't know that it's necessarily chasing that job, salary raise thing.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is what that journey looks like for everybody can be something completely different, right? For some people, it's a religious journey. For some, it's, I don't even know, but like something completely different. But it's just like, it all probably starts with like a similar question, and then everyone goes down their random different paths and discovers it. And actually, I think oftentimes, although the findings from that journey can be interesting, they're often pretty irrelevant to another person. They just don't help.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Like, kind of back to this point that, like, we all have life with like an n=1 data set. So like we only have the one life. Means that, I think there's a lot to be said for just, you've got to have that, have that journey yourself, and you can take a lot of advice from other people that have been on similar paths and maybe steer you well. I think that's exactly what something like this podcast is really good for, to hear from lots of different perspectives. But at some point, it is something you've kind of got to think about and go on as yourself. And look, I've been incredibly lucky in my life, right? A great family, great friends. I met Bella, my wife, like, in college, right? Like all of those things, right? There's a lot of things that have kind of come really good, but that's not to say I haven't had to separately think about how I become happy, content, satisfied. And I that's been a different, at least in my experience, that's been a different journey to the career path that we've talked about. And I don't know what you think about this, but look, like, we're not, in the grand scheme of things, we're not either old or mature, I like to think. But I have a very different perspective on this when I came out of college, right? Where I thought, if I did X, Y, Z, then, that will be the moment that I'm content, right?
I sometimes think, geez, when I sit down and I'm 40 or when I'm 50, I'm going to look back at me when I was this age. I'm going to think I was such an idiot, It's like, oh my God, I thought that was what was important. And now, so much, I've got it all figured out, But so I clearly don't.
You at 70 would probably look back at you at 50 and say, oh, what an idiot.
100%. But then I think the other thing is, what I've heard is like, if you don't, then you haven't changed, right? So it's kind of like, well, you got to pick one of either evils here. So, look, I think, I think that's a really good place to wrap up. I think this is a great conversation, like covering everything from the very practical side of things, perhaps the more esoteric. So, thanks a million for coming on.
Like all of our best conversations. Super. Thank you, Stephen.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation that I just had with Philip. There was a couple of things that I found particularly insightful that I'm going to take away and think about a bit more and maybe apply into my own life. And the first one of those was about the importance of not getting your sense of self-worth from your job. So this is something that I probably realized only a year or two ago, but when you're able to realize that, how you perform in work is important, but it's really not everything. And like, your self-worth and happiness, like, shouldn't be dependent on how you perform there. It does two things. One, it just makes you overall like a happier, less anxious, less stressed person. But then too, it actually also helps you to perform a bit better in your work. And it was interesting to hear Philip talk about that, especially from his background in sports and sports psychology, and being able to say he was able, that ability to be able to detach the two of those and say, well, I'm going to focus on, the process in my work and what I'm doing and really striving to get good results. But at the end of the day, if they don't happen, because there's a million reasons that they mightn't happen, that is okay too. And it's especially interesting to hear from somebody who's been, so successful in their careers to have that attitude, because I don't think it's something that you would necessarily think from somebody who's achieved as much as he has. The second one was just the quick little thing, which was when he's making decisions, he asks himself the question, would this make me an interesting person, or which choice would make me a more interesting person? And I just love like little questions or little sentences that you can add into your decision-making process around career or life decisions, and just give you a different lens through which you can look at things. The third one was about work and life not being a binary option. So we always talk about work-life balance and the fact that, if we want to spend more time outside of work, whether it's hobbies or with friends and families, that is going to mean spending less time in work and sacrificing work results. And Phil's point was like, that doesn't need to be the case at all. And in fact, they can work together really well. And so I thought it was super interesting to hear him talk about that, and especially say that, his job is reliant on him making good decisions, and he can't make good decisions, or he makes better decisions if he's not stressed, if he's happy in his personal life. Then he can come to work and he can make really good decisions with a clear mind. One of the other things I thought was, when I asked him about like, what skills do you think are most important or have helped you to progress as quickly as you have and land a job as a CEO at such a young age? And he said it's all about building relationships. It's clear that he is good at it and that he enjoys it. And it's a skill that is really important, I think, especially even for people early on in their career to think about. Because, if you're joining a graduate program, or if you're an analyst or even an associate in certain levels of programs or in certain jobs, oftentimes you're just thinking like, okay, I just need to get my job done. I need to build a model, create the presentation, launch the campaign, whatever else it is. And it can be very transactional, but actually the skill that's really worthwhile developing over time is how well can you build relationships, whether that's with people on your team, your managers, your boss. And how he said that the biggest thing he does to do that is just be a real person, no matter who they are. Realize that they're a real person, and that's just such a natural and authentic way to build those relationships. So they were just a handful of the things I took away from this conversation. There's going to be tons more, especially when I listen back on it again. But I really hope you enjoyed it and that you took something from it as well. If you want to follow the Two Roads on socials, you can. On Instagram, it's at Two Roads Pod. And on LinkedIn, you can just find me on my personal profile. It's Steve Duke. So I share a lot of the insights and summaries from the podcast itself, but then I also create other content to help people think through how they can find a job in life that they love. All right, that's all for this week, and I will see you next time.